They came on a Tuesday, not with a warning, not with a broadcast signal or a polite knock on the atmosphere. They came the way a hammer comes down on a nail, fast, final, and completely indifferent to what was underneath it. 712 ships, each one the size of a city, each one carrying weapons that made nuclear warheads look like bad ideas scrawled on napkins. The scientists who had spent their careers scanning the skies for signs of intelligent life. The ones who had dreamed of this moment, written papers about it, argued about it at dinner parties. Most of them didn't survive the first hour. The aliens had a name for themselves, but the human tongue couldn't hold it. So humanity called them what they looked like. Wraiths. Gray and silent and enormous, moving through space like they owned it because they did. They had owned 43 star systems before they found Earth. They had cleared those systems the same way a farmer clears a field. Not with hatred, not with anger, just with the calm, efficient certainty that nothing growing there mattered. That was the thing nobody had prepared for. Not the size of the fleet, not the firepower. The thing that broke people, that cracked generals and presidents and hardened soldiers straight through, was the indifference. The Wraiths didn't hate humans. They didn't fear them. They had looked at Earth, looked at everything on it, and made a decision the way you decide to clear a table before setting it for dinner. Inconvenient, removable, gone. But they made one mistake. One error in 43 systems worth of conquest. They assumed that because humanity was small, it was breakable. They had never met a species that had spent 10,000 years at war with itself. They had never encountered a civilization that had survived plagues, famines, world wars, genocide, and its own worst instincts, and kept going anyway. They had never faced soldiers who had already lost everything and decided that was not enough reason to stop. The Wraiths came to clear a field. They found a field that had been on fire for 1,000 years. And they found that some things, once set burning, do not go out. This is not a story about humanity winning cleanly. There is no clean win in these pages. There are no heroes who walk away whole. There are no speeches that save the day, and no technology discovered at the last moment that turns the tide without cost. This is a story about what happens when you back something into a corner that has spent its entire existence learning how to survive corners. This is a story about the battle-scarred, the broken, the stubborn, the absolutely unreasonable human refusal to simply stop. They came on a Tuesday. They should have come on a day when we were weaker. There wasn't one. The first ship appeared over the Pacific Ocean at 4:17 in the morning, and for 11 minutes, every telescope on Earth was pointed at it, and nobody said a word. It was not the way people had imagined it. For decades, movies have shown first contact as a single vessel descending through clouds, landing in a field or a city square, doors opening with a hiss of steam while the world held its breath. People had imagined the moment as singular, as one thing happening in one place that could be watched and processed and eventually understood. What happened instead was this: the sky split. Not metaphorically. The upper atmosphere over the Pacific lit up in 17 locations simultaneously, each point of light expanding outward in a ring of displaced pressure and heat that pushed satellite debris and space junk ahead of it like a bow wave. Tracking stations in Hawaii, Japan, Australia, and the western coast of North America picked up the signals at the same moment. The Pacific Fleet's radar systems registered what they were seeing and then, because the data didn't fit any known category, flagged the readings as instrument error and attempted to recalibrate. By the time human minds accepted what the instruments were telling them, the ships were already in low orbit. Not one ship, not 712 vessels arrayed across the orbital band like a necklace made of cities. The smallest of them was 4 kilometers from nose to stern. The largest, a central command structure that astronomers would later calculate displaced more mass than the island of Oahu, stretched 18 kilometers, and moved through the upper atmosphere with the lazy, unhurried patience of something that had never been challenged by anything in its path. General Maria Reyes was awake when it happened. She had not been sleeping well for 3 weeks, which was not unusual for her, and she was in her office at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado going through personnel reports when her aide knocked and opened the door in the same motion, which was how she knew it was serious. Her aide was a meticulous man named Lieutenant Okafor, who believed deeply in knocking and waiting. He had never in 4 years of service opened a door before she answered. She looked up. His face told her everything before his mouth did. "How many?" she said. Not a question, A calculation beginning. Current count is over 700, he said. And they're not stopping. General, they're descending. She was already standing, already moving. She had spent 31 years in uniform across 4 different conflict zones on 3 different continents. She had been in firefights in mountain passes where the temperature was -20 and in desert cities where the heat came off the pavement in waves that bent the air. She had lost soldiers she had loved. She had made decisions that had cost lives and lived with those decisions every morning when she woke up. She was not a woman who panicked. She was a woman who assessed. She assessed this. 700 ships. Descending. No communication attempted. No signal sent. No broadcast on any frequency that human equipment could detect. They had appeared, and they were coming down, and they had not said a single word. "Give me the president," she said. "Give me NATO command and the Joint Chiefs. Get everyone on a call in the next 4 minutes, or I will personally end careers." "Already done, General. The call is waiting." She stopped at the door and looked at him. "You knew before you knocked." "I started the calls when the first readings came in," he said. "I knocked because I thought you deserved 30 seconds to process it before the world started asking you what to do." She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked through the door. The world did not process it well. That is the generous way to say what happened in the first 6 hours. The less generous way is to say that civilization, the project of 10,000 years of human cooperation and conflict and gradual, painful organization, came very close to coming apart before a single weapon was fired. Stock markets crashed so fast that automated circuit breakers triggered in 22 countries, and then the circuit breakers themselves were overwhelmed and shut down. Airports in 30 cities saw simultaneous mass evacuations as people tried to get anywhere that felt safer than where they were, which was everywhere, which meant the roads filled and the terminals filled, and the movement itself became the crisis. Governments that had nuclear arsenals pointed at each other had fingers suddenly hovering over buttons because the instinct in the face of the uncontrollable unknown is sometimes to reach for the things you understand, and what some governments understood best was the weapon. 3 nations nearly launched in the first 2 hours. One came within 40 seconds. What stopped them, in each case in different ways through different conversations, was the same argument delivered by different people in different rooms. That argument was simple. It was not eloquent. It went like this: if we shoot at each other now, we will definitely die. If we wait, we might not. Those are better odds. It was not an inspiring position, but it was a functional one. Meanwhile, the ships descended. They did not land. That was the first tactical piece of information that the military minds of Earth had to work with. The Wraith Fleet, nobody was calling them that yet. That name came later from a junior analyst in the UK who wrote it in a briefing, and it spread because it did not touch ground. They settled into a hovering position roughly 3 kilometers above the surface, distributed across every major populated region on Earth. Not just cities, every region. The analysis came in over the first 18 hours as military satellites and civilian observation systems and scrambled fighter aircraft painted a picture of the distribution pattern. They were everywhere that humans were dense, everywhere that humans were clustered. The orbital coverage alone suggested a level of prior reconnaissance that turned cold in the stomach when you thought about it. They had been watching. They had known where to go. They had mapped every settlement, every city, every town over a certain population threshold, and they had positioned a vessel above each one. Not to communicate, to cover. The first weapon fired was not fired by the Wraiths. It was fired by a 19-year-old conscript soldier in a country where panic had infected the chain of command all the way up to a general who had not slept in 30 hours and who made a decision that he would spend whatever remained of his life trying to take back. The soldier's name was not recorded in the early histories. He fired a shoulder-mounted missile at the underside of the nearest hovering vessel. The missile traveled 400 meters and then stopped. Not exploded, not deflected. Stopped, as if a hand had reached out and caught it. It hung in the air for 3 seconds, long enough for every camera pointed at that vessel to capture the image, and then it crumbled. Not dramatically, not in fire. It crumbled the way wet paper crumbles when you close your fist around it. The components fell to the ground in a rain of scrap, and nobody moved for a long moment. Then, the underside of the vessel opened. What came out was not what anyone expected. People had imagined energy weapons, particle beams, the science fiction staples of 1,000 stories. What came out of the first Wraith vessel was a field. a low hum that built to a frequency that concrete responded to before skin did. Buildings within a half-kilometer radius developed hairline fractures simultaneously. Cars vibrated off their axles. People close to the epicenter reported a pressure behind the eyes that built until it was the only thought they had. Then, the field expanded. The town it covered, population 12,000, went silent. Not the silence of death. The silence of unconsciousness. Every person, every animal, within the field's radius dropped where they stood. The field ran for 90 seconds. Then it stopped. The vessel sealed itself. Nothing further happened. The analysis of that first demonstration took 4 hours. By the end of those 4 hours, Maria Reyes had 3 separate briefs in front of her, and all 3 of them said the same thing in different technical language. The Wraiths were not trying to kill. Not yet. They were demonstrating. They were showing what they could do if they chose to. It was the most chilling briefing she had ever read, and she had read briefings about nerve agents and dirty bombs and cyber attacks on power grids. This was worse because of what was missing from it. There was no demand, no ultimatum, no communication of any kind. A species that can knock out a town without casualties and then simply wait has no need to negotiate. It is not asking for anything. It is not giving you a chance to comply with conditions. It is showing you the shape of your own helplessness. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she called Lieutenant Okafor and told him she needed a secure line to every resistance-capable military unit on Earth, because she had a different read on what the Wraith demonstration actually meant. Okafor came in with the connection list already pulled up. "What's your read, General?" "They showed us the weapon," she said. "They didn't use it at full scale. They didn't knock out a city. They knocked out a town as a message." She tapped the brief. "That's not what a species looks like when it's committed to extinction. That's what a species looks like when it wants us to stand down without a fight." Okafor said nothing for a moment. "And if you're wrong, then we die trying something instead of dying while we wait." She picked up the line. The next 72 hours were the most exhausting of Maria Reyes's life, and she had once been awake for 60 hours straight during an operation in the Zagros Mountains where the supply line had collapsed, and the weather had come in, and 3 decisions made before dawn had saved 40 lives, and she had not slept for a day after because she kept turning over the 3 decisions and the one she had made. This was different. This was not 3 decisions. This was the continuous construction of a response framework for something that had no framework, no precedent, no manual, no doctrine written for it anywhere on Earth. The Wraiths demonstrated 3 more times in those 72 hours. Each demonstration was clean. Each one targeted a small settlement, rendered its population unconscious for a control period, and then stopped. Know this: no damage beyond structural vibration cracks. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. They were calibrating responses. They were showing a menu, one item at a time, of what they were capable of doing at increasing scale. It was a countdown without numbers. The governments of Earth, fractured, terrified, arguing over jurisdictions and command structures, and who had the authority to speak for humanity, if anyone did, could not agree on a response. The UN Security Council met continuously and produced nothing executable. Individual nations made unilateral announcements that contradicted each other. 2 countries that had been in a cold conflict for decades found themselves suddenly allied by sheer paralysis. 2 others that had been allied for a century found themselves arguing over whether humanity's best move was complete surrender or immediate full military engagement, which was an argument that had no good answer because both options led to the same place. Maria Reyes stopped watching the political process after hour 48. She had spent her career working within systems, respecting chains of command, understanding that the structure of authority existed for reasons that were usually sound. She still believed that. But she also understood that there are moments when the system is gridlocked and the situation is moving and you have to make a choice about which one you serve. She chose the situation. What she built in those 72 hours, on phone calls and encrypted video links and in a classified facility carved into a Colorado mountainside, was not an army. She didn't have the authority or the resources to build an army. What she built was a network. Every officer she had ever served with who was still breathing and still believed in something other than surrender. Every weapons developer, every engineer, every physicist who had taken a call in the last 3 days about the Wraith ships and had not simply said the word impossible and hung up. every intelligence analyst who had been cataloging the demonstration data and had something more to say about it than "here is what we cannot do." She built a network of people who were still asking what can be done. The network had no official name. It operated outside the formal command structure because the formal command structure was currently a building full of people yelling at each other in 3 languages. It had no flag and no insignia and no funding that any government had explicitly approved. It had something better. It had people who had already lost something and decided that losing more was not acceptable. The last message she sent before the 72 hours ended was to a man she had served with in the mountains 15 years ago. His name was Commander Yusuf Adeyemi, and he was currently on a submarine in the North Atlantic that had gone dark the moment the Wraith ships appeared, because Adeyemi was the kind of man who understood that going dark was sometimes the most strategic thing you could do. She sent him 4 words. She had the coordinates of a weakness in the Wraith sensor grid that her analysts had identified in the demonstration data, a gap, small and possibly temporary, in the electromagnetic coverage pattern of the nearest vessel. The 4 words were, "I found a seam." She hit send. Then she looked out the narrow window of the mountain facility at the sky, which was the dark gray of early morning, and which, if she tilted her head, showed the faint geometric shadow of the nearest Wraith vessel blocking out the stars. It had been watching. It had never considered that something small might find a way in. The submarine was called the RSS Kestrel, and it had been sitting 300 meters below the surface of the North Atlantic for 11 days with its reactor throttled to minimum, and its crew doing the thing that submariners do better than any other human beings alive, which is wait in a dark metal tube with no windows and act like this is fine. Commander Yusuf Adeyemi had read Reyes's message 4 times before he moved. Not because he didn't understand it. He understood it immediately. He had known Maria Reyes for 15 years, had served under her in conditions where the briefing and the reality had been completely different things, and he had learned that when she said she found something, she had found something real. The 4 words were not a request. They were not even an order in the traditional sense. They were a signal between 2 people who had built the kind of trust that comes from surviving things together, a signal that said, "We're moving now. Are you in?" He was in. He had been in since the moment the Wraith ships appeared, and he had ordered the Kestrel dark, because going dark was not giving up. Going dark was the first move in a game that most people had decided wasn't playable. He called his senior officers to the small briefing room that smelled of recycled air and old coffee and metal and told them what he knew. Not all of it. The intelligence Reyes had sent was fragmented, incomplete, delivered in the compressed code they had developed over years of working together, but the core of it was clear enough. The Wraith sensor grid had a pattern. All sensor grids have patterns because they are designed by minds that have assumptions built into them, and assumptions always create gaps. The Wraith designers had assumed that anything coming toward their vessels would come fast and hot. Missile trajectory, energy signature, the kind of approach a species makes when it is trying to punch through a defense. They had not designed for slow and cold. A submarine running at minimum power, creeping through water at 4 knots, generating a thermal signature roughly equivalent to a large tuna, using passive sonar only, moving on a trajectory that kept it outside the electromagnetic footprint of the coverage pattern. That was a gap. Not a guaranteed one, not a wide one, but a gap. The Kestrel's weapons officer, a compact woman named Lieutenant Commander Priya Sharma, who had joined the Navy because her father had said she was too small to be a soldier, and she had interpreted this incorrectly as a challenge, looked at the data Adeyemi laid out, and said nothing for a long moment. "They're not watching the ocean," she said finally. Not a question, a realization landing. "They're watching everything that can reach altitude," Adeyemi said. "Their demonstrations have all been against land targets. Their sensor array is oriented upward and outward, covering air and space. The ocean floor is 100% outside their detection envelope if we stay below their baseline thermal threshold, which we can do, for about 6 hours of approach window before the grid pattern shifts." Sharma looked at the trajectory calculations. "And then what? We surface inside the gap. And do what exactly? We fire conventional torpedoes at a ship the size of a city." "No." He spread the second part of the intelligence brief on the table. "We don't fire at the ship. We fire at the anchor point. The Wraith vessels, it turned out, were not entirely independent. The analysis had taken Reyes's team days to piece together, working from the demonstration data, from the interference patterns the ships produced in global communication systems, from the subtle gravitational signatures that the largest vessel, the central command structure, generated in the instruments of every university physics department and research station on Earth. The fleet was networked. This was not surprising. What was surprising was how. The connection was not electromagnetic. It was not light-speed radio or encrypted transmission burst. The Wraith fleet communicated through a mechanism that human physics had theorized but never observed, a localized gravitational entanglement that linked every vessel in the fleet to the central command structure in real time, regardless of distance. The theory was that this was how they coordinated so perfectly, how 712 ships could move in absolute synchrony, how a demonstration on one side of the planet could be informed by sensor data from a vessel on the opposite side within milliseconds. It also meant that if you could disrupt the entanglement, not destroy it, not attack the vessels directly, just introduce enough noise into the gravitational coupling, the fleet would lose its synchronization. For how long was unknown. What would happen to a fleet of that size and complexity when the real-time coordination link dropped was also unknown. Unknown was another word for possible. The weapon that Reyes's team had designed in 72 hours, which was not enough time for anything under normal circumstances, and was also apparently exactly enough time when the alternative was extinction, was not a conventional warhead. It was a gravity pulse generator built from the components of 3 different experimental physics projects that had been running in university basements and government laboratories and the private workshop of a South African engineer named Dr. Kalani Nakamura, who had been trying to build a more efficient mining drill and had instead, somewhat accidentally, built something that resonated at the exact frequency of the entanglement coupling. The device was the size of a large refrigerator. It weighed 400 kilograms. It had never been tested at full scale. Dr. Nakamura, who was currently sitting in the cargo hold of the helicopter somewhere over the Atlantic being sick into a bag while the helicopter flew through a storm because it had to avoid the Wraith sensor envelope, and the only route that did so went through a weather system currently producing 40-knot winds, had built it in 62 hours on 3 hours of sleep, and what she described as a concerning amount of black tea. Will it work? Adeyemi had asked her over the encrypted line. She had made a sound that he had decided to interpret as yes. The Kestrel began its approach run at 300 hours, running cold and slow and dark through water that was very close to 0 degrees and that pressed against the hull with the patient indifference of deep things. Adeyemi stood in the command space and watched the instruments and did not speak because everyone on this boat knew what to do, and any word he said was a word that used oxygen and created noise, and right now neither of those was something he had to spare. Priya Sharma stood beside him. She had been doing the thing she always did when she was calm, which was the exact same thing she did when she wasn't calm, which was stand with her hands clasped behind her back and look at whatever she was looking at with the expression of someone doing a very difficult arithmetic problem in their head, and not yet having the answer. Adeyemi had learned in the 2 years he had commanded the Kestrel that when Sharma looked like that, she was working. She was always working. The expression meant nothing except that her brain was running at full capacity, which it always was, so the expression was essentially meaningless as an emotional indicator and completely reliable as a sign of engagement. He found it comforting in the way that reliable things are comforting when everything else is unpredictable. The approach took 4 hours and 16 minutes. In those 4 hours and 16 minutes, 3 things happened that Adeyemi had not planned for. The first was that the storm above them intensified and changed direction, which meant the helicopter carrying Dr. Nakamura and the device had to reroute and was now running 40 minutes behind schedule. 40 minutes was not catastrophic. The sensor gap window was 6 hours, but it shrank the margin. The second was that a Wraith vessel moved. Just one, over the eastern coast of North America, sliding 30 kilometers south of its original position in a slow drift that the analysts watching from space couldn't explain and couldn't predict. The drift didn't close the gap, but it changed the geometry of the approach angle enough that Sharma had to recalculate the surface position for the deployment, and she did this in 11 minutes with a pencil on paper because the electronic navigation system had been offline since they went dark, and she had been doing the math by hand this entire time because that was the kind of officer she was. The third thing was the radio signal. It came in on a frequency that no human technology used. It came through the passive hydrophone array. the listening system that could detect the sound of water moving against the hull of a distant vessel. What the hydrophone picked up was not water. It was a vibration in the water itself, a modulated wave that the Kestrel's acoustic analysis system flagged as artificial and structured before flagging it again as unrecognizable. Adeyemi listened to the translated tone through headphones and felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up in the way that it did before firefights, and in dark rooms, and in the moment before something changed. The signal was not targeting them. The analysis came back in 6 minutes from his acoustic specialist, a young man named Petty Officer Chun, who had the look of someone permanently surprised by how often things turn out to be interesting. The signal was originating from below them, from somewhere on the ocean floor. It was directed upward toward the Wraith vessels. It was repeating on a regular interval. Someone or something was already in contact with the Wraiths. From the bottom of the ocean, Adeyemi looked at Chun. Chun looked at Adeyemi. Nobody said the word. It landed on the deck with a thump that was harder than it should have been, and the rotor wash was enough to make the deck crew grab for handholds, and the cargo door opened, and Dr. Kalani Nakamura stepped out looking like someone who had been through a washing machine set to the wrong cycle. She was 43 years old, 5'2", and currently wearing a life vest over a university sweatshirt that said something optimistic about engineering in faded block letters. Her hair was doing several different things. She was still carrying her tea, which had somehow survived the helicopter. She looked at the ocean and the sky and the distant geometric shadow of the Wraith vessel, and then she looked at Adeyemi. "Did you know," she said, "that I applied to 3 different space agencies before I decided to go into private research?" "I did not," he said. "They all said I wasn't a team player." She looked back at the Wraith ship. "I want them to see this." He almost smiled. "Can you deploy the device?" She held up her tea. "Give me 5 minutes and something stronger than this." The deployment took 22 minutes. Nakamura worked with 2 of his engineers, and she did not explain what she was doing except in fragments that the engineers wrote down, and later said they mostly understood. The device went into the water on a tethered buoy array that held it at 30 meters depth, precisely positioned on the deployment coordinates that Sharma had calculated by hand. Nakamura ran the activation sequence from a tablet connected to the array by a cable that looked to Adeyemi like the kind of thing sold at hardware stores for outdoor extension use. He did not say this. She ran the sequence. The cable went taut. The instruments on the deck unit registered a shift in the local gravitational field that the needle countered by spinning in the wrong direction for 2 seconds before correcting. Nothing appeared to happen. Adeyemi was about to ask when the Wraith vessel on the horizon went dark. Not dark in the sense of lights out. Dark in the sense that the field effect it generated, the faint shimmer of displaced heat and electromagneticum that had been present over every Wraith vessel since their arrival, simply stopped, like a breath held. Then, in the distance, so faint it was more felt than heard a tone. Deep, below hearing, felt in the chest, and the back teeth, in the place behind the eyes. The vessel began to drift. Not falling, not crashing. Drifting the way a ship drifts when its engine's cut, and the current takes it. Except this was a ship 3 kilometers long drifting through air, and doing so with the slow, uncertain movement of something that had lost, for the first time in its existence, the signal that told it where all the other pieces of itself were. Chun came out the hatch with his headphones around his neck, and his permanent expression of surprise at full intensity. "Commander," he said, "the signal from the ocean floor. It stopped when..." Same moment the vessel went dark. Adeyemi stood on the deck of his submarine in the early morning of a world that had been invaded 11 days ago, and looked at the drifting Wraith vessel, and thought about the signal from the ocean floor. Someone had been in contact with them. Past tense. He filed that in the part of his brain that held things that needed to become someone else's crisis later, and looked at Nakamura. How long will it hold? She had her head tilted back, watching the drifting vessel with an expression that he could only describe as professional satisfaction. The expression of a person whose math had worked. "Unknown," she said. "That's not an answer. Unknown means could be minutes, could be hours." She sipped her tea. "But I know something else." "What?" "This one vessel losing synchronization will trigger a diagnostic cascade through the entire network. Every vessel in the fleet will run a self-check." She lowered the mug. "They're going to be busy for a while. All 712 of them." She looked at him. "You want a window? You have a window." He looked at the drifting vessel, at the pale morning sky, at his crew on the deck, watching. He thought about Maria Reyes and the word seam. He thought about the signal from the ocean floor. The kind of crew that doesn't need to be told twice because they understood the weight of the moment the same way he did. The last one down was Nakamura. She paused at the hatch. "Commander," she said, "the agencies that rejected me." "Yes. I hope at least one of their satellites is still working well enough to see this." She went below. The hatch closed. The Kestrel slipped under the water and was gone before the Wraith vessel above the horizon finished its slow, disoriented drift, and the communications equipment aboard it went silent in a way that, for the first time since their arrival, suggested that the Wraiths were not entirely certain what had just happened. That uncertainty lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. It was the most valuable 3 hours and 40 minutes in human history. The signal from the ocean floor was not a mystery for long. It became a different kind of problem instead, which was worse. The acoustic data from the Kestrel reached Maria Reyes at the mountain facility in Colorado 14 minutes after Adeyemi transmitted it, because Adeyemi's communications team had routed the transmission through 3 separate relay nodes and a borrowed civilian satellite that had survived the Wraith arrival without being knocked out, which was something else to notice, something to add to the growing pile of things that didn't fit the narrative of an indifferent species just clearing a field. Reyes listened to the converted audio of the signal 3 times. It meant nothing to her ears. It was a structured vibration, artificial, clearly engineered, but in a language she had no key to. She sent it to Dr. Amara Osei-Bonsu without explanation. Osei-Bonsu was a xenolinguistics professor at the University of Edinburgh who had been, for the entirety of her career, in the polite professional wilderness that is the natural habitat of anyone in a serious academic institution who specializes in languages that don't exist yet. She had published papers. She had given talks at conferences that were well attended by enthusiastic people who were also professionally marooned. She had a framework built over 20 years for analyzing the structural properties of any communication system regardless of its substrate: written, verbal, electromagnetic, chemical. The framework was theoretical. It had never been tested on real data. She was eating cold soup from a can in her Edinburgh flat, which was now inside the coverage zone of a Wraith vessel, and was experiencing a persistent low vibration in the walls that she had been ignoring by focusing very hard on her work when the file arrived from Reyes. She listened to it once. She called Reyes back in 9 minutes. "I need the original wave data," she said. "Not hello. Not how are things given the alien invasion. Just a request. It's already been sent." "Amara, there are 2 voices in this signal." Reyes stopped. "Explain." "The signal isn't a broadcast. It's a response. There's a call and response structure embedded in the wave pattern that only becomes visible when you run it against the baseline resonance of the Wraith vessel's own electromagnetic output." Osei-Bonsu's voice had the quality it got when she was thinking faster than she was speaking, words arriving slightly behind the thought. Someone was communicating with the Wraith fleet. Not to them. With them. Back and forth. I need the full data set to tell you how long, but the signal I have shows at least 12 exchanges. From the ocean floor. No. A pause. The ocean floor is the relay point. The origin is on land. The cold that moved through Reyes had nothing to do with the temperature in the facility. "On land," she said. "On Earth. Someone on Earth has been talking to the Wraiths since before they arrived," Osei-Bonsu said. "Possibly significantly before." The investigation that followed that call was conducted in controlled silence, because Reyes understood immediately that if the information leaked before she knew the scale of it, the result would be the collapse of whatever fragile network of trust held the resistance framework together. Paranoia is not irrational in a context where someone has already betrayed the species. But uncontrolled paranoia is a weapon pointed at the people using it, and she could not afford to lose the network to itself. She ran the investigation with 3 people. Lieutenant Okafor, who found things because he was constitutionally incapable of not following a trail once he started. Intelligence analyst Captain Fatima Al-Rashid, who had spent 12 years tracking financial and communication networks for non-state actors, and who treated all data the same way a surgeon treats an open patient, carefully with appropriate gravity and clean instruments. And a man she had never met in person, a former NSA signals analyst who went by the handle Corvus and who operated from a location she had never been given, and who was currently, as near as she could tell, the most capable communications intercept specialist alive. Corvus cracked the origin signal in 6 hours. He sent the results without comment. No preambel, no contextualizing, no editorial. Just coordinates and a name. The coordinates place the origin of the communication at a research facility in central Norway, a privately funded deep Earth geophysics station built into a mountain 40 kilometers from any city, operating on a decommissioned mining infrastructure, officially studying seismic activity and deep mantle composition. The name attached to the facility's founding charter was a man named Dr. Henning Lasse. Reyes recognized the name, not from the current crisis. From 15 years earlier, from a classified brief about a European consortium of private space technology companies that had been probing the edges of gravitational wave research in ways that had attracted, briefly, the attention of 3 different intelligence agencies and then been assessed as harmless and filed away. Harmless. She had made that assessment herself. She sat with that for a moment. Not guilt. Guilt was not useful. Assessment. She had read what was presented to her and made a call based on incomplete information, which was the only kind of information that ever existed, and the call had been wrong, and what mattered now was what she did with the correct information. How many people are at the facility? She asked Okafor. Current satellite imagery shows 11 individuals. The geophysics research team. He paused. And one anomaly. What kind? The facility has a sub-basement level that isn't on any official record. The foundation permit, the construction documentation, the environmental impact filing, all of it stops at the primary level. But the thermal imaging from a satellite pass this morning shows a heat signature 40 meters below the declared base of the building. Something running, something large and running and warm. Al-Rashid came in with the financial analysis. The facility had received funding over a 17-year period from a chain of corporate entities that dissolved and reformed with new names at regular intervals. A pattern she described as exactly what you build when you want to maintain continuity of funds while making the source systematically untraceable. The chain terminated in a financial structure so deeply nested that it had taken her most of the 6 hours to find the terminus. And when she did, she sat with it for a while before she brought it to Reyes. The terminus was not a human institution. The financial structure at the root of 17 years of funding for the Norway facility did not correspond to any bank, any corporation, any government entity, or any shell company on record. It corresponded to an account structure that had been injected into the global financial system from outside it, through a mechanism that Al-Rashid described as theoretically impossible and practically obvious in hindsight. Someone had placed money into the global financial system from outside the global financial system. 17 years ago, Reyes looked at that for a long time. The Wraith fleet had been visible for 11 days. The preparation had been running for 17 years. That gap told a story she didn't want to read, but needed to. The Wraiths had not simply arrived and started clearing. They had been setting conditions. They had found, somehow, through some mechanism she didn't yet understand, a human being willing to prepare the ground. Not to help humanity prepare a defense. To prepare the ground for the arrival. To smooth it. To ensure that when the fleet appeared, certain systems were compromised, certain responses were pre-disrupted, certain capabilities were already degraded. She thought about the demonstration that had knocked out a town, but hadn't killed anyone. She thought about the sensor gap that Adeyemi had exploited, a gap that seemed almost convenient in retrospect. She thought about whether any of this was happening in the shape it was happening in because someone had arranged it. She did not know the answer. What she knew was that there was a sub-basement in a Norwegian mountain with something warm and large inside it, and a man named Henning Lasse who had spent 17 years talking to the people currently hovering over every city on Earth. She put together a team and sent them north. The team that went to Norway was 8 people. Not soldiers in the conventional sense. Soldiers in the sense that Reyes defined it, which was people who had already been through things that should have broken them and hadn't, and who had come out of those things with the kind of specific hardness that isn't aggression and isn't recklessness. It's something quieter. The knowledge that they had survived the unsurvivable before and were, at minimum, willing to try again. The team leader was a woman named Captain Seo Jeong, South Korean Special Operations, currently technically outside her national command structure and operating on the same informal basis as everything Reyes was running. She was 38 years old and moved through space with the quality of someone who had spent so long being underestimated that she had stopped noticing it, which was its own kind of strength. She had been given the Norway file at 0200 hours local time and had assembled her team and been airborne within 90 minutes. The flight was low and indirect, threading the sensor gaps that the Kestrel's disruption had temporarily widened. The window was closing. The Wraith fleet's diagnostic cascade was running down, and the synchronization was recovering vessel by vessel, but the Norway trajectory remained inside the gap for the duration they needed. They landed on a frozen lake 2 kilometers from the facility at dawn. The facility looked like what its documentation said it was. A research installation built into a hillside, modest in scale, the kind of building that says we're doing science here, and nothing else in the muted language of functional Scandinavian architecture. Satellite dishes on the roof. A small generator building. The main entrance, a reinforced door in the hillside face, closed. 2 vehicles in the parking area, which suggested the team inside was not expecting company. CO moved her team through the approach with the kind of precision that requires very few words, because the words have all been said in the planning phase, and what remains is execution. They came in from 3 angles. They had the parking area secure in 4 minutes, and they had the main door open in 6. The facility inside was quiet, clean. It looked exactly like a geophysics research station. Data monitors, seismic analysis displays, the unremarkable clutter of scientific work. The 11 research staff were in the main monitoring room, and they were, every one of them, at their workstations, and none of them moved when CO's team entered, which was the first wrong thing. Not frozen with fear, just still, working, as if nothing unusual was happening. CO approached the nearest researcher, a man of about 30, and said his name. She had the staff roster from the investigation file. And he turned and looked at her with eyes that were present and calm and focused and completely absent of the reaction that a person has when armed strangers walk into their workplace during an alien invasion. "You know why we're here?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Where is Lasse?" The researcher turned and pointed at the floor. Down. The sub-basement access was in a server room at the back of the facility, behind a cabinet that had been pushed aside recently enough that the floor dust showed drag marks. The hatch was not locked. It was not alarmed. It opened on a stairway that went down a long way, lit by LED strips along the floor edge, and at the bottom was a door that was not reinforced, not sealed, not protected in any way that suggested the person behind it was trying to keep people out. CO went down alone. Her team held the top. The room behind the door was large, 30 meters across, ceiling 8 meters high, cut directly from the rock, and what it contained was something that stopped CO in the doorway for 3 full seconds because her brain needed that time to build a category for it. In the center of the room was a structure, not a machine in the sense of moving parts and mechanical function. A structure the way a crystal is a structure, grown, not built. It rose from the floor in a configuration that her eyes initially read as natural, as something geological, before the regularity of the geometry asserted itself. Perfectly regular, deliberately patterned, made of a material she had no name for that was darker than the rock around it, and that caught the light and did something with it that standard reflection doesn't do. Standing beside it was a man of about 60, thin, with the specific thinness of someone who has been existing on the energy of their work for a long time and has forgotten that the body has other requirements. He was looking at the structure, and he did not turn when she entered. "Dr. Lasse," she said. "Yes." Step away from the structure. He turned then. His face had the look of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. Not relief exactly. The complicated, exhausted feeling of an ending. "They didn't come to clear us," he said. "That's the misunderstanding. That's been the misunderstanding from the beginning. Move away from the structure, doctor. They came because of a signal." He looked at the structure. Not their signal. Ours. Something we transmitted 80 years ago that reached them and told them we were here. He finally stepped back from it. Not because she had told him to, but because he was done standing there. I've been trying to explain that to them for 17 years. That we didn't know what we were transmitting. That it wasn't an invitation. CO kept the distance between them and kept her hand where it needed to be and kept her eyes on him and said, "Do they understand you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said, "that they are starting to." The structure behind him pulsed once. A single, slow light, deep inside it, moving outward through the material like a heartbeat. CO's radio went off. Her second in command, up top. "Captain, the vessel to the south has stopped drifting," meaning the disruption window was closing, meaning the fleet was coming back online, meaning the diagnostic cascade had finished and the Wraith ships were reconnecting to each other, and the brief, temporary condition of uncertainty that the Kestrel's device had created was ending. She looked at Lasse, at the structure, at the light fading in its depths. "Can it send?" she said. "Yes. Can it send something that will make them stop what they're doing right now and listen?" He looked at her for a long time. She didn't flinch. She had the hardness, and she had the patience, and she had the experience of surviving unsurvivable things. And she stood in the sub-basement of a Norwegian mountain and waited. "Not listen," Lasse said. "But there's something else." He turned back to the structure. His hands found specific points on its surface. Not controls, not buttons, the way you find the keys of an instrument you have played for years. The light inside it shifted. "There's one thing to respond to," he said. "In 17 years of communication." "One thing." "What?" "Proof," he said, "that there is something here worth more alive than cleared." His hands moved. The structure sang. The structure sang, and in orbit 712 ships paused. Not in the way of the disruption that had been mechanical, a failure of connection, a ship that had lost its signal and drifted with the particular helplessness of anything suddenly unmoored. This was different. This was voluntary. The kind of stillness that belongs to a mind that has just encountered something unexpected and is making a decision about what to do with it. Maria Reyes was watching live telemetry when it happened. The Wraith vessel's electromagnetic signatures changed simultaneously, the faint oscillating field effect shifting in frequency the way a tuning fork shifts when a second one is struck nearby. She was on the line with Adeyemi, and she heard him say nothing for 3 seconds and then exhale. "What is that?" he said. "Unknown," she said, which was her honest answer, but she said it with more hope than the word usually carries. In the sub-basement of the Norwegian mountain, Henning Lasse played the structure the way he had been learning to play it for 17 years. Not a performance, not a calculation, something in between, the way a translator works when the two languages involved have completely different concepts of what language is for. Co Ji-young stood 6 feet behind him and watched and did not interfere because she had made the most important tactical assessment of her career in about 4 seconds flat, which was that this man was the only asset in the room and that interfering with him would produce no outcome she wanted. Lasse had gone to the structure at 43 years old, which was when the funding had materialized in his research account from a source that he had spent 6 months trying to trace and had not been able to, and he had made a decision that he had never fully stopped questioning, which was to use it. He had told himself it was for research. He had told himself that the communications he was receiving from the source of the funding were simply data, structural information about the device he was being asked to build, and that the act of building it did not constitute a moral commitment of any kind. He had been wrong. He had known he was wrong from about year 3. He had kept going because the alternative, stopping, trying to explain what he had built, trying to describe to institutions that operated on the normal human schedule of urgency and bureaucracy and politics why there was an alien communication device in a mountain in Norway, seemed not just difficult, but impossible. And because by year 3, the structure had begun to talk back. Not in words. Not in anything that could be transcribed or translated in the traditional sense. The structure communicated in patterns of implication, the same way deep mathematics communicates, the way music communicates, reaching past the language center of the brain to something older and more fundamental. He had learned to read it the way you learn to read weather, not as a language, but as a grammar of cause and condition of intention made visible through the arrangement of things. What the structure told him over 17 years was this: the Wraiths were not a species in the way humanity understood species. They were old, older than anything Lasse had a reference frame for. They had seeded and cleared and moved and built and demolished across a volume of space that dwarfed any human conception of territory. They did not do this out of cruelty. They did not do this out of resource competition or territorial aggression. They did it because they had long ago decided that complexity, biological complexity, the specific kind that produces variation and conflict and innovation and art and war, was a problem, a source of instability, something that complicated the steady, ordered expansion they had committed themselves to. They had encountered hundreds of species. All of them had been cleared, because none of them had demonstrated, in the Wraith framework of value, that the complexity they produced was worth the instability it carried with it. The structure sang now because Lasse was transmitting the argument he had been building for 17 years. Not a plea, not a negotiation, an argument, a demonstration, The specific kind of proof the wraiths would recognize, presented in the only medium they processed as valid. He was transmitting the record, not selected highlights, not humanity's best moments, curated for an audience. Everything. The full, compressed, 17-year compiled record of human complexity in its actual form, which included the wars and the genocides and the collapses and the cruelties and the betrayals, but also woven through all of it like a thread that refused to break, the art and the music and the mathematics and the science and the moments when something small and corner decided not to stop, decided against all rational assessment of odds that continuing was better than not, and did. Things that no species running a purely rational calculus of survival would do. He was transmitting the human record of surviving its own worst self. He was transmitting it not as evidence of virtue, as evidence of complexity. The specific kind of complexity that produces at its extremes both mass murder and the Sistine Chapel and splitting the atom and 12-year-old kids staying up past midnight to write code that doesn't work yet. The kind that cannot be fully predicted or fully controlled. The kind that is, by the Wraith definition, unstable. But also, and this was the argument, the kind that had in 10,000 years produced something no other cleared species had produced. Self-correction. Humanity destroyed things, and then built institutions to prevent the same destruction. Humanity committed atrocities, and then imperfectly and slowly and with enormous resistance, developed frameworks to recognize and prosecute those atrocities. Humanity went to war, and then wrote treaties, and then broke the treaties, and then wrote better treaties. Humanity was not good, but it was something more interesting than good. It was learning. 17 years. One argument. The structure carried it upward through the rock and through the ocean floor relay and into the grid that connected every Wraith vessel to every other Wraith vessel. Lasse took his hands from the structure. The room was completely silent. In the silence that followed, in the facilities and vehicles and submarines and command centers and basements and sheltered rooms where the people of Reyes's network were watching the telemetry, three things happened in sequence that were afterwards described very differently depending on who was doing the describing. The first was that the central command vessel, the one that was 18 kilometers long, the one that had not moved since its arrival, the one whose mass displaced the gravitational instruments of every physics department on Earth, began to rotate. Slowly, a fraction of a degree, but it rotated. It had not done this before. It had not moved at all since arriving. The rotation was not threatening, not the repositioning of a weapon. It was reorientation, the kind of movement a mind makes when it is turning to look at something with full attention. The second thing was that the Kestrel's hydrophone array picked up a signal from below them, not from the ocean floor relay this time, from the water itself, all around them. A resonance that propagated through the water column from the surface down, a structured vibration that Chan spent 4 minutes staring at before he said, very carefully, "Commander, I think this is a response." Adeyemi put the headphones on and listened, and he thought, standing in the narrow metal space of his submarine, of the structure in the Norwegian mountain, and of Lasse's hands on its surface, and he thought of the argument, and he thought about what a response meant. A response meant the structure's signal had reached. A response meant the Wraiths had heard the argument. It did not mean they agreed with it. The third thing was that 2 Wraith vessels over the North American continent moved away from their coverage positions. Not retreating, moving to a new configuration, one that the military analysts watching the telemetry couldn't fully categorize because it didn't fit either an attacking formation or a withdrawal pattern. It was a posture they had not seen before. It was as if a very large, very old thing had shifted its weight from one foot to the other. Reyes had been awake for 31 hours. She was standing in front of a display showing the orbital distribution of the fleet, watching the 2 vessels move, watching the Central Command ship's slow rotation complete itself, and she made a decision. She opened a channel. Not the military command channel, not the network channel, a different frequency, the one that Lasse had given her before CO's team departed for Norway, the frequency that the structure used for transmissions, and that she had been told. She had not been told this would work. She had been told it was theoretically possible, could carry a human signal in a form the Wraith network would receive. She did not make a speech. She was not a speech-making kind of person. She was a general who had spent 31 years making assessments in conditions of incomplete information. She made an assessment. "You've been watching us," she said into the channel. She didn't know if language reached them, but Lasse had told her that intent sometimes propagated in the signal structure, even without translation. You watched us for a long time before you came. You know what we are. She paused. You know we fight. You know we build things and break them. You know we're the kind of complicated that makes messes. Another pause, shorter. But you also saw what happened this week. We found a seam in your sensor grid that you didn't design a gap into. We built a device in 62 hours that disrupted your synchronization, and we built it from parts designed to dig holes in the ground. We found the Norway facility, and we listened to what Lasse has been trying to tell you for 17 years. She looked at the display. The Central Command vessel's rotation had completed. It was still now, but still differently than before. We are complicated, she said. We are unstable. We make messes that take centuries to clean up, and we make the same mistakes 20 times before we stop making them, and sometimes we don't stop. She put her hands flat on the table. But we also find seams. In everything. In systems that have never been challenged. In grids that have never been tested. We find the seam, and we go through it, and that has nothing to do with intelligence. It has nothing to do with technology. She was quiet for a moment. It has to do with the fact that we are absolutely unreasonable, she said. We will not stop. That is not a threat. That is not a negotiating position. That is a description of what we are. We're the thing that finds the seam and goes through it and keeps going. She took her hands off the table. You cleared 43 systems, she said. We know that now. We know you didn't hate them and you didn't fear them. You just didn't think they were worth the complexity. She let that sit. We think you should look again at what complex means. She cut the transmission. What happened next is the part of the story that is hardest to tell in terms of cause and effect, because the cause, the transmission, the structure's argument, the 17 years of Lasse's work, the disruption from the Kestrel, the entire accumulated weight of everything that had happened in 11 days, produced an effect that was not binary. It was not a decision. It was a process. The Wraith fleet did not withdraw. It also did not attack. Over the next 48 hours, the Central Command vessel moved. Slowly, with the pace of something that takes its time because it has never been rushed, it changed its orbital position. Not departing, repositioning. Moving from its hovering station over the Central Pacific to a location that the orbital analysts tracked and calculated and eventually identified as a gravitational equilibrium point, a stable orbit at a distance that placed it outside the atmosphere coverage band but within communication range. One by one, over the 48 hours, the other vessels followed. Not all of them. 183 Wraith vessels remained in their low hovering positions over the population centers of Earth. The other 529 moved to the higher orbit. The pattern was unmistakable once it became clear. The ones that remained were not the most powerful vessels. They were the ones with the highest communication equipment density. The ones built or modified for sustained contact. They weren't withdrawing. They were making room for a conversation. Reyes was still awake when the last of the repositioned vessels reached its new orbit. She was sitting in a mountain facility with Okafor and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she was thinking and the telemetry display showing the new fleet configuration. Okafor stood beside her and looked at the display for a while. Is this a win? He said. She looked at the 183 vessels still in position, at the 529 in the higher orbit, at the Central Command ship, stable and massive and ancient, sitting at its equilibrium point like a thought that had not yet finished itself. I have no idea, she said. Is it better than where we were 11 days ago? She thought about the demonstration over the town, the crumbled missile, the cascade failure, and the device, and Nakamura's hands on a tablet connected to a hardware store extension cord. Lasse in his sub-basement, hands on a structure that sang. Yes, she said. It's better. She picked up the cold coffee. Drank it anyway. Give me Lasse on a line, she said. And someone should probably tell the UN Security Council that the war they've been preparing for is possibly not a war. What is it then? She looked at the display. The beginning of the most complicated thing we've ever done, she said. Which means we're probably suited for it. Outside the facility, the sky was dark and full of stars, and if you knew where to look, the faint geometric signatures of an alien fleet that was, for the first time since its arrival, listening instead of waiting. Listening was not safety. Listening was not peace. But it was something humans had been learning to do for 10,000 years, badly and incompletely and with enormous resistance. They knew how to work with that. The conversation took 3 years. Not metaphorically, Not in the diplomatic shorthand, where 3 years of negotiations means a series of formal meetings and position papers and carefully managed summits with catered lunches and interpreters in glass booths. 3 actual years of continuous, active, impossible communication between a species that measured its history in 10,000 years and a species that measured its history in cycles of stellar formation. 3 years of Henning Lasse in his sub-basement, hands on the structure that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, translating intention into pattern and pattern back into intention. 3 years of Amara Osabansu, building a framework for a grammar that had no prior category in human linguistics, and that required, she said once, the complete abandonment of the assumption that communication is primarily about information transfer. 3 years of Maria Reyes managing a planet that was trying very hard not to collapse under the weight of what had happened to it, while also somehow remaining functional enough to participate in the most consequential dialogue in human history. 3 years of the 183 communication vessels holding their positions and the 529 others waiting in their higher orbit, patient and vast and indifferent to the political convulsions taking place below them. This is not a full history of those 3 years. A full history would require a different kind of book and a different kind of patience. What this is, instead, is the end of it, the moment the conversation reached a point where something had been decided. Not everything, not all at once. The Wraith framework for decision-making did not operate on human timescales or human scales of finality, and one of the hardest lessons the communication team learned in year one was that asking for resolution was not just premature, but was itself a form of category error, like asking a river when it would be finished flowing. But something had been decided, or rather, a position had shifted in a way that Lasse described when he reported it with the expression of a man who is not sure whether to be relieved or terrified. They've placed us in a category, he said. He was in a mountain facility in Colorado, which had become the unofficial central node for everything happening, because Reyes had decided early that the mountain was where she could work best, and definition of work had expanded to encompass approximately everything. He sat across from Reyes and Okafor and Osebansu, who had flown in from Edinburgh with 2 overfull bags, and the look of someone who had not been outside for several months and found the concept of outside theoretically interesting. What category? Reyes said. They have a classification system for what they encounter, Lasse said. It has many levels. The levels I've been able to understand are at the extremes. At one end is something I can only translate as standing matter, meaning matter that is present but not doing anything worth the complication of engagement. At the other end is something I translate as active current, meaning something that has enough complexity and generative potential to justify not just preservation, but contact, relationship. He stopped. We're not at active current, he said. I want to be clear about that. We may never be at active current by their definitions. But we've moved off standing matter. To what? Osebansu said. The category I can best translate, he said, is something like worth watching. The room held that. Worth watching was not safety. It was not peace. It was not a guarantee. It was a classification applied by a species that had cleared 43 star systems to a species that had, over 11 days of invasion and 3 years of dialogue, demonstrated enough of something that the Wraith assessment had shifted from removable to not irreplaceable. Not essential, but interesting enough that the calculus of clearing had become more complicated than it had been for everything else they had encountered. Worth watching meant the fleet was staying. It also meant, for the first time, that the fleet's presence was no longer purely threatening. In the months that followed, things changed in the way that things change after a crisis that didn't fully resolve. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small adjustments that add up to a different world. The Wraith vessels in low orbit shifted their coverage patterns. The field effect that had been constant, the hovering ship's passive electromagnetic hum that disrupted satellite communication and made everyone within their shadow feel a faint persistent pressure behind the eyes, reduced in intensity. Not gone, reduced. Enough that cities under the communication vessels functioned again. Enough that the persistent, low-level anxiety that had become background radiation for urban life in the months after arrival decreased to something that people could work with, which was different from comfortable, but was also, they had learned, enough. Dr. Kalani Nakamura returned to her workshop, which had been relocated to the mountain facility at Reyes's request, and which had become, in 3 years, less of a private workshop and more of an institution that refused to behave like one. She had 12 people working with her now, none of whom had any formal affiliation with any existing research program, and all of whom she had recruited by the method of asking one question: what problem keeps you up at night? She was working on 3 things simultaneously, 2 of which she described as definitely possible, and one of which she described as theoretically insane and possibly the most important thing she had ever thought of. The device that had disrupted the Wraith synchronization had never been used again. Reyes had made that decision in year 1 of the dialogue and had defended it against significant pressure from the military structures of several nations who wanted either to improve the device and hold it as deterrence or to use it as a negotiating chip. She had argued, with the consistency of someone who had made up her mind and was done entertaining the alternatives, that demonstrating what humans would not do was exactly as important as demonstrating what they could do. The device existed. The Wraiths knew it existed. Lassay had communicated this, not as a threat, but as a fact, because honesty was one of the few things the communication team had identified as something the Wraith framework responded to positively. It was in a sealed facility. It would not be used unless the fleet violated the position it had moved to. That condition had held for 3 years. Reyes thought it would hold as long as both sides treated the holding of it as a demonstration of intent rather than a sign of weakness. So far, both sides had. The moment that felt like an ending, the one that Reyes would go back to later and identify as the point when she understood that the crisis had become something else, happened on an ordinary Tuesday in March, 3 years and for months after the fleet had appeared. She was in the small office she had been using at the mountain facility. It was a room with one narrow window that looked out at a slope covered in pine trees, and at this time of year the trees had snow on them, and the light came through thin and cold and clean. She had been working for 5 hours, and her coffee was cold again because she kept forgetting it. Lieutenant Okafor. He was a colonel now, a promotion that Reyes had put through twice before the bureaucracy had processed it, the first time having been lost in the general administrative chaos of a planet reorganizing itself after an alien occupation. Knocked and waited and entered when she answered. He had a tablet. He handed it to her. On the tablet was a readout from the gravitational sensor array that Nakamura's team had installed around the facility. The readout showed a signal that had originated from the central command vessel, 80 kilometers above them in its equilibrium orbit, and had been directed specifically at the mountain, not at the communication structure in Norway. At this building, not at any building, at this room. The signal's structural pattern was one Osebonsu's team had cataloged in year 2 as a specific communicative form, something translated imperfectly as directed attention. The gesture of looking at something specifically rather than generally. Something being examined consciously and individually rather than scanned as part of a larger survey. It's been sitting in the sensor data for 6 hours, Okafor said. The analysis team flagged it this morning. Reyes looked at the readout for a long time. The central Wraith command vessel, the largest and oldest thing currently in the solar system, had for 6 hours been looking specifically at her. Not at Earth. At her. She sat with this for a while. Then, she looked up at the window. At the pine trees with their cold weight of snow. At the thin winter light. At the sky above the trees that was the pale, opaque white of high cloud with, if she tilted her head, the very faint dark geometric suggestion of something in orbit that was patient and vast and very old and was, for reasons she did not fully understand and might never fully understand, paying attention. Tell Lassay, she said. Okafor made note. What do you want to tell them back? She thought about the question for a long time. She thought about the seam in the sensor grid and the forward message and the 62 hours and the cold coffee and the Navy and the device and Nakamura's expression of professional satisfaction on the deck of a submarine. She thought about a man in a sub-basement who had spent 17 years trying to explain that a signal sent 80 years ago had not been an invitation, just a message from a species that didn't know it was being heard. She thought about a town that had been knocked unconscious and woken up whole. She thought about worth watching. Tell them, she said, that we're still here. She thought about it for one more second. Tell them that's not an accident. The Wraith fleet is still in orbit. All 712 vessels. This is, depending on who is asked and when, either the most terrifying fact of the current age or the most extraordinary. Both are correct. Both fit inside the same truth without contradiction, which is itself, Reyes has come to think, one of the more human things about the situation. The dialogue continues. It will continue for a very long time. It will be difficult, and it will produce failures and false translations and moments of crisis and recoveries from crisis, and it will require, from every generation that inherits it, a willingness to sit with complexity and resist the demand for resolution. It will require the specific, stubborn, absolutely unreasonable refusal to stop. Some things, once set burning, do not go out. Henning Lasse is still in the sub-basement with the structure. He is 63 years old, and he has the look of a man who has found his purpose late and is making use of every remaining day of it. The research team above him has expanded. There are now 47 people in the facility and 12 in a satellite installation in Iceland and a collaborative group in Osaka that operates independently but shares data and that has in the last year begun to receive something from the structure that Lasse describes as proactive communication. Not responses, but initiations. The right side of the dialogue, choosing to send rather than waiting to be sent to. This is new. This has not happened before in 43 systems. Amara Osibansu has written one paper about the linguistic framework she developed for the dialogue. It is 190 pages long and references 14 disciplines that do not normally share citations, and it was rejected by 4 journals before being published by a 5th, which is a journal she had founded herself specifically because the 4 rejections had made her practically furious. The paper's conclusion, which she wrote in a single afternoon and then did not change because she could not improve it, reads, "The Wraith communication system is not designed for the transfer of information between equals. It is designed for the evaluation of potential. Whether any given signal is considered worthy of a response depends not on the clarity or sophistication of the signal, but on what the signal and the entity that produced it demonstrates itself capable of becoming. The longest conversation in human history began not because we were understood. It began because we were in some imprecise, but real sense, interesting. The task of the next generation is to continue being so." She is currently working on the second paper. Yusuf Adeyemi retired the RSS Kestrel in the second year of the dialogue. He stood on the dock and watched the submarine go to reserve status with the expression of a man saying goodbye to a particular life. And then he went to work for Reyes's network in the coordination capacity that she had been pushing him toward for 2 years, and that he had been resisting because it felt, he said, like giving something up. Reyes had told him that giving the Kestrel up was not a loss, but a redistribution of the same thing. He had said that was a very convenient argument for her to make. She had said she was aware of that. He took the job. Priya Sharma took command of the Kestrel when it came back off reserve status 6 months later, which happened because someone had decided the submarine was too important a piece of history to mothball and had routed a funding request through channels that Reyes had definitely not used, and Okafor had also definitely not processed. Sharma took it out for its first run under her command, and then she brought it back and filed her report, and in the section for mission notes, she wrote 4 words that the archivist who found the report 3 years later would describe as the most concise summary of the period she had ever read. The 4 words were, "We are still here." Maria Reyes stays in the mountain facility. She has been offered other positions, other roles, other rooms, and other buildings with better views. She stays because the work is here, and because the window with the pine trees is sufficient, and because she has learned, over a career that has cost her things she does not enumerate, that the question of where you should be is usually answered by where the work is. The work is here. On ordinary mornings, she drinks coffee before it gets cold and looks at the telemetry and thinks about the things that need doing. On extraordinary mornings, and there are more of them now than there used to be, because the dialogue produces extraordinary developments on its own schedule without consulting hers. She reads the overnight reports and calls Lasse and calls Adeyemi and calls whoever needs to be called. And she works. She is 61 years old, and she does not sleep as well as she used to, but this is not new. On the morning that is the last morning of this story, she stands at the narrow window and looks at the pine trees and at the cold light and at the sky. The central command vessel is up there. She cannot see it, but she knows it is there the way you know where north is once you've oriented yourself. Not visible, but present, part of the geometry of where you're standing. It looked at this room 6 months ago. It looked at this room for 6 hours, and she sent back 2 sentences. Yesterday, it looked again. Different signal structure. Ose Bonsu's team is still analyzing it. What they have so far is a component that maps to something between a question and an invitation. Not resolved, not clear, but structured in the direction of those things. A question and an invitation from a species that has never asked one before. Reyes finishes her coffee. She turns from the window. She goes back to work. Outside, in the cold morning air in the pine trees, a bird she doesn't know the name of makes a sound that carries in the thin air and then stops and then starts again, because that is what birds do. Because that is what things that are alive do. They make sound and go quiet and make sound again, and somewhere up above the clouds, very far away, old patient things adjust their instruments and listen. And the bird keeps singing, and the sky holds both of them. And the world, complicated and unstable and absolutely unreasonable, continues.